I've been asked recently to do a video on divorce and remarriage. Of course, I would probably just like to skip right ahead and get into the remarriage verses, but some of you may have a misconception of what a marriage is, so we better start with that first. Now, what constitutes a marriage in the Bible? Some people think that this is a marriage, or some people think that this is marriage. But we shouldn't listen to people for our final authority on the subject. In the Bible, 1 Corinthians 6:16, we read that a sexual union constitutes a marriage. And the Apostle Paul says, kind of incredulous, that he says, "What? Know ye not that he which is joined to a harlot is one body? For two, saith he, shall be one flesh." This is a marriage, although sadly, it's with the harlot. Marriage is never a ceremony. Ceremonies are done for legal purposes, but we are interested in what the Bible says on this subject, not governments. Obviously, the first marriage was between Adam and Eve, and there is no ceremony, and no local authorities to report to. One might accuse me here of being in favor of common law marriage, and I'm not. But the goal here is to determine what the Bible defines as marriage, not what your state government says. After all, if your state said a man could marry an animal, would you continue to adjust your definitions by what they say? So before things got crazy and everyone had to have a storybook wedding full of glitter, the best indication that you were married was when the father of the bride brought his daughter to your tent. The father brings the bride and then leaves, and everyone knows about it. That's telling the whole village that the father is no longer responsible for the daughter, and this man is now responsible. This is exactly what Laban did when he left his daughter Leah at Jacob's tent. Now, don't get me wrong. Oh, sure, there was a nice feast just before this, probably a ceremony. But the marriage isn't really a marriage until the man gets the woman all to himself. Now, we still maintain a bit of this tradition today as the father of the bride walks the woman down the aisle. The long walk of the aisle represents the walk from Dad's house all the way to the husband's house. And although American fathers are made fun of, as they are portrayed as being more nervous than the bride herself, back then it was probably a relief to the father, because up until that time, he had to protect the daughter and keep her pure from all the boys in the neighborhood. It would shame the entire family if it were discovered that the woman was not pure upon entering into a marriage. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not against weddings or ceremonies. Just realize that according to the Bible, a marriage is not a ceremony, nor is it a piece of paper. Marriage in the Bible is a sexual union, pure and simple. So now we move on to the subject of divorce. Now, getting a divorce used to be difficult 100 years ago, but today it's not that difficult. And because of this, many Christian churches are faced with having to deal with these subjects, and they haven't done a very good job. There are 3 scriptural allowances for divorce, and in all 3 cases, remarriage is a possibility. Number 1 is fornication, and we find that in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verse 9. "And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery." So right away you have an allowance for remarriage, and it's based on fornication. Now, the second grounds for remarriage is plainly death. You read in Romans chapter 7, verse 3, that if a woman marries another man because her husband is dead, she is not committing adultery. Now, the reason people do not look at this verse as divorce is because people think that divorce is a piece of paper. Yet the context is obvious. Flesh being separated from flesh. In this case, death causes the divorce. Keep in mind, divorce is division, removal, and complete separation. And notice that remarriage is in the context, and the remarriage is perfectly fine. Obviously, when one person dies, God has put them asunder. An act of God divorces the dead party from the living party. It would be pagan to think they are still married. In India, they would throw the living wife into the grave with the dead husband that's being burned if she didn't go willingly into the fire. Thankfully, we do not do that. And besides, it is not biblical. The third biblical allowance for remarriage is abandonment. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, we see that if one married person abandons the other, the abandoned person is no longer bound to the marriage. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister, you see it's a Christian being talked about, is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. You are not bound to the party that deserts, just as the surviving party is not bound to be buried alongside the dead at the time of the funeral. A brother or sister is not bound under any of these three cases. Now, although most Christians won't bother you too much if a widower gets remarried, but teaching only one of these remarriage allowances is basically a two-thirds lie. The same results occur when we teach two of these, yet we neglect one of these allowances. You would be a one-third liar. You'd basically be lying 33% of the time. And you shouldn't trust anyone that lies 33% of the time. Remarriage is not hindered by the following three things. Number one, death. The living party is not bound any longer and is free to remarry. Number two, desertion. The abandoned party is not bound any longer and is free to remarry. Number three, fornication. The party that did not fornicate is no longer bound and is free to remarry. Now, the opposition to this biblical definition of remarriage is the lie they tell when they say the divorced woman who remarries is walking around with two husbands at the same time. This is impossible. Under the law, a divorced woman cannot go back to the first husband, even if the second husband dies. I'll be reading from the first 4 verses of Deuteronomy 24, but it's verse 4 that I'm showing you here that has one powerful word that cannot be argued against. I'll start at verse 1 while you watch the little pictures. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. Verse 2, and when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. Verse 3, and if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and give it at her hand, and send her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that she is defiled, for that is abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So did you happen to notice the key word in verse 4 that ends all arguments about former husbands and wives? It's the word former. And it's usually the legalistic Pharisee of today that want to argue the finer points of the law with you. Well, you can't get more finer a point than this one word in Deuteronomy, which means a second telling of the law. It says her former husband. Former, as in no longer. That man is no longer her husband. And who said so? Why, the Bible said so. There it is, in black and white. You may know a couple that divorced, and after separating and staying single, they both realize that they made a mistake, and they get back together. This happens from time to time, but if a woman marries husband number 2, and they have sexual relations, which in the Bible is a marriage, she is not permitted to return to the former husband. That is called an abomination. Now, here is a photograph of former presidents. Any one of these men might go on a television show and be introduced as President so-and-so. But that's just the Hollywood announcer trying to be overly respectful. They aren't truly president anymore, and should not be introduced that way. They are former presidents and no longer have access to the nuclear football that contains the codes necessary to launch nuclear attacks. This was handled nicely in the movie about John Adams, our second president. When leaving the White House and climbing aboard a cab with local people, he didn't like them staring at him oddly, so he says, "Stop gawking. I'm just plain John Adams, just an ordinary citizen." They are former presidents. And former husbands are just ordinary citizens, so the people that claim a remarried woman is guilty of having two husbands just because both men are still breathing are wrong. Because by default, when she's divorced from husband number one, it would be a sin to return to husband number one. And it can't possibly be a sin to be reunited with your husband, right? Therefore, the Bible teaches that she is no longer married to husband number one. To argue that a divorced and remarried woman is walking around with two husbands goes against the Bible. Sorry. Have a nice day. The same applies to a deacon or minister. If a deacon has been remarried in the past and has been allowed one of these three biblical allowances for remarriage, then everything is fine. Otherwise, reading too much into the phrase husband of one wife would disqualify all pastors and deacons that became widowers at any point in their lives. Now, I have placed nothing inside the verses listed earlier. If the opposition wishes to quote 1 Timothy chapter 3, then let them not add any words to the verses. 1 Timothy chapter 3 says one wife, not one historical wife, or one wife ever. You cannot cut and paste or drag and drop the word ever into the verse. Now, I know your college professor did it all the time, but let's grow up and play by the big boy rules for a change. Otherwise, no widower who remarries could ever hold office because he had been married before. A Pharisee or Catholic reads that verse, and in their mind they add the word ever to the passage. But it doesn't say one wife ever. It merely says one wife. Let's let the Bible be our final authority for a change, and not your lace-wearing denomination. And since the opposition would point to the allowances for death only, I ask them why they ignore the other two allowances. The reason 1 Timothy chapter 3 is important, it shows us how difficult it would be to have ministers and deacons who are married and committing adultery. Any minister committing adultery is guilty of having more than one wife. And let's face it, his stepping out on his wife from time to time would keep him way too busy to be of any use to anyone as a deacon in a local church. And in cultures where they have more than one wife at a time, that man is having to keep a more complicated and stressful household than your average Joe. And for the opposition who is upset with me quoting from Old Testament Deuteronomy 24, then let me call their attention to Paul basing his whole teachings on marriage according to the law. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law. There Paul is bringing up the subject of the law found in Deuteronomy. Verse 2, for the woman which hath a husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. Many of the opposition are actually guilty of stepping out on their own wives. But since they haven't been caught yet, and since they think that marriage is a ceremony or piece of paper, they point the finger wrongly at innocent parties or at other people. Now, I happen to like ceremonies. I think it's helpful for a couple to make a public showing of their intentions, but just because someone declares you are husband and wife doesn't make it so. A minister can declare that fried chicken is a cure for chicken pox, but that doesn't make it so either. The marriage takes place when the two parties join flesh. This act usually takes place shortly after the ceremony. In the Bible, once that second marriage takes place, and you have joined your flesh to another person, you give the first spouse the biblical right to divorce you. You've basically made your bed, now lie in it. Don't listen to anyone who tells you that you must divorce your current spouse so that you may return to the former spouse. It is amazing that Pharisee-minded Christians think all sins can be forgiven except sexual sins. They must have a fixation on sex. Now, I'm probably going to make fun of some of you that are watching this video. I have shown you with Scripture why the average Joe, whose wife left him for no good reason back when he was in his 20s, and you treat him like a second-class citizen, demanding that he remain a eunuch the rest of his life. I'm trying to show that he is able to hold the office of minister or deacon. You'd like to keep him under your thumb the rest of his life, but according to the Bible, he should be allowed to hold offices in the church in spite of remarriage. And yet you despise this video because you've had an advantage over the average Joe. Your wife didn't leave you, so that somehow makes you superior. But just because your marriage didn't break up, does that mean you've been super Christian all this time? What if your wife just never bothered to leave you because she's lazy? Let's face it, her sticking around may not have always been for spiritual reasons. Maybe it's been convenient, but don't let that stop you from patting yourself on the back because you've managed to hold your marriage together due to your being the spiritual leader that you are. It's high time that we let the average Joe out from under your thumb and your denomination's thumb. And let's face it, any true biblical study of this subject will be blindingly clear that deacons are men. Men that are married to a wife. And that brings me to the other group that I want to make fun of. Some of you won't like this video because you secretly know your wife won't like this video. And that this part may make her upset because she thinks that being a deacon is another huge step forward for girl power. And you are a tender ninny because you don't have the backbone to open the Bible and let it straighten out your whole family. In your so-called spiritual household, this is what your wife wears. And this is what you wear. And you know it, deep down. Besides, letting the women run things at the church business meeting sure did free your time up for more important things, didn't it? So don't bother trying to tell me otherwise. Now I realize this might be kind of harsh to you. You're not used to this kind of biblical teaching. I'm sorry for that. I better make it nice and easy for you. I better leave you on a real warm and fuzzy moment. So may God bless your studies.